Thank you. Apologies for delayed start there. Are there any statements from honourable members? Yeah, opposition goes first. So, member for Canning.
Yes, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, it didn't take long for the Albanese government to take a sledgehammer to one of the most important infrastructure projects in Canning. Only 6 months since the election, and Labor has put the Pinjarra heavy haulage deviation on the back burner. Only 6 months into the Albanese government, and they are delaying a project that will take trucks and heavy vehicles out of the historic Pinjarra township. It only took 6 months for Labor to show its true colours. We all know the Prime Minister and Labor have given up on the people of Canning, but delaying the start of this important infrastructure is appalling. The Shire of Murray and the people of my electorate have supported my fight to fund the Pinjarra heavy haulage deviation for years now. Back in 2017, the Shire of Murray electors voted 84% yes in a referendum for the deviation. Why? Because more than 690 trucks pass through the Pinjarra township every day, and the deviation will get them out of town, making the community safer and the transit easier for truckies. With the people of Pinjarra and the Peel region backing me every step of the way, we secured $200 million from the former coalition government to get this project on the road. But now Labor has hit the brakes and work won't start until at least 2026. The people of Canning, though, have been here before. They know that Labor is kicking this critical project into the long grass so the Prime Minister's razor gangs can quietly cut it. But I know something the Prime Minister does not. We won't take this lying down. During the last parliamentary recess, I was in Pinjarra and I saw with my own eyes a heavy load passing through town. I saw firsthand how traffic is brought to a standstill. I saw the hazards faced by the families of Pinjarra who battle immense semi-trailers and road-borne mining equipment just to get their kids to school. We've also secured new businesses into the township, including the historic Exchange Hotel being renovated and reopened soon. Pinjarra will become a great weekend location, a Fremantle down in the heart of Peel. And the people of Pinjarra are angry. They are frustrated, as I am, that projects that will make our roads safer are being pushed out and then cut. And how typical is this of Labor? Well, just weeks ago, the Premier, Mark McGowan, made a rare visit to Pinjarra with Transport Minister Rita Saffioti and Pinjarra's State MP Robin Clark, who has remained silent on this, to announce that construction on the deviation would begin in 2024. And where is Mark McGowan now? Where is Robin Clark now that the project has been kicked into the long grass? He's run 1 million miles and she's run 1 million miles. Well, it's not good enough for them to turn up for a photo opportunity and take credit for a road that we delivered the funding for. The people of the region trusted Mark McGowan, they trusted Robin Clark to fight for our community. They've trusted Anthony Albanese to deliver, but they have been let down. And I call on the Prime Minister to reverse this appalling decision and get this project off the ground as quickly as possible.
I call the Assistant Minister and member for Jellicoe.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. We're less than a fortnight away from Australia's first game in the FIFA 2023 World Cup. And this week, I was really proud to see the announcement of the Socceroos 26-man squad for the tournament. It was a squad that reflected modern Australia, confident, diverse and connected with every corner of the globe. It was particularly significant to see a record 4 African-Australian players selected in the squad: Aware Mabil, Garung Cole, Thomas Deng and Keanu Bacchus. As the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, I've been working to reinvigorate Australia's relationship with African nations, and a big part of Australia's connection with the African continent is the 500,000 Australians of African heritage who make a remarkable contribution to our nation. And over the next month, this contribution is going to be in the spotlight in the form of these 4 young Aussies on the biggest stage of all and the biggest sporting tournament in the world. The excitement machine, Garung Cole, at only 18 years of age, is the youngest man ever selected to play for Australia in a World Cup. Cole is a devastating attacking player, scoring in just 5 minutes after his A-League debut for the Central Coast Mariners, before quickly signing for the Premier League in Newcastle. Thomas Deng made his Division 3 debut with the Western Eagles in my patch in Melbourne's West, before going on to captain the Olyroos and to win player of the match in their famous 2-0 win over Argentina at the Tokyo Olympics, just down the road from where he now plays in the J-League for Niigata. Keanu Bacchus rose to the elite soccer ranks via Western Sydney Wanderers before signing in the Scottish Premiership, where his coach at St Mirren has declared that everyone in the town of Paisley and St Mirren will be supporting the Socceroos in the World Cup as a result. But I admit that my favourite player is Aware Mabil. Aware not only pulled an Aloisi for the Socceroos, kicking the winning penalty against Peru to qualify the Socceroos for the World Cup, but he's been a genuine humanitarian, co-founding the Barefoot to Boots, Australian-based NGO, supporting refugees in camps like Kakuma in northwestern Kenya, where Mabil and Thomas Deng's families sought refuge for years before coming to Australia. I was thrilled to see Barefoot to Boots work firsthand when I visited Kakuma myself in 2018 and made a delivery of football kits donated by soccer clubs in my electorate in Melbourne's West. We should celebrate these young Australians for their extraordinary achievement, not just of making it to the pinnacle of their profession, but for doing so while overcoming such enormous challenges. African people's connections to Australia go back to well over 200 years, and they tell a remarkable story of tenacity in the face of hardship. Our continents and our peoples are connected, but Australia hasn't always engaged with African countries as deeply or as knowledgeably as we could. I'm trying to turn that around. For the next month, the one field that all Australians will be focused on is the pitch that the Socceroos will be playing on in Qatar, and the 4 African-Australian Socceroos who will be doing us proud. Kul, Mabil, Deng, Bacchus will be representing more than just the Socceroos of Qatar. Together they represent modern Australia for all the world to see.
The member's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Lyme.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is a really significant and enormous challenge in confronting Australian households and businesses, and that is the skyrocketing cost of electricity. Households are really feeling the pinch with direct electricity price increases, despite the Prime Minister's outrageous promise that he's broken many times that prices would actually go down by $275. Now, local businesses in my electorate, whether it's with a business with 4 employees or 20 employees or 53 employees, they're all the same. Their businesses run on electricity as a major business cost. Cafes, coffee shops, mechanics, panel shops, local manufacturers, steel fabricators, retail, medical services, big abattoirs, transport companies, supermarkets who refrigerate a lot of their goods. The whole supply chain that's refrigerated is under pressure because electricity delivers refrigeration. And just as your electricity costs for running your fridges and your air conditioners and your TVs and your computers, also the big energy users in the modern digital world, the cloud runs on oodles and oodles of energy. A lot of the cloud explosion is being limited because a lot of these cloud centres need oodles of energy. Whether you look at Ireland or England or Australia, it's the same. Many of them are turning to putting in their own diesel generators so they can expand the capacity of their data centres. Now, solar and wind will be part of our energy mix like they are, but we need to realise that integrating renewables in all the grid extra costs, the short lifespan of them, and all the extra grid and ancillary services are making the electricity bill for the electricity that arrives at your power plug, not in the middle of a paddock or in a solar farm, where, yeah, it is cheap at the top of a mountain. But that mountain has to, that wind turbine or that solar farm has to go through the grid, and the grid is being eaten away in a technical sense by too much variable renewable energy. The grid can't cope. That's why the costs are going up. And what used to be cheap baseload is now being told to turn off by the National Electricity Market rules and regulations. So their cheap efficiency is vanishing. What we can do is educate Australia about the economics, the viability and the plug-and-play nature of nuclear power plants. Australia has all these bans at state and federal level based on fear and misconceptions, and it's up to us, because we have to deliver the energy and the availability and the affordability for the nation, to educate people. And many of your union members have worked out that what we've worked out... The
member's time has expired. And I give the call to the member for Calwell.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to acknowledge 2 very different community events which took place in my electorate in recent weeks. The first was the end-of-season awards presentation of the United Khalsa Hockey Club, which I attended just a couple of weeks ago, actually. And this vibrant youth sporting club runs out of Craigieburn in the northern part of my electorate and serves a community of mostly Sikh families. It's an absolute delight to witness the enthusiasm of all the young hockey players, from as young as the under-10s through to the under-17s, and hear from many of them about the difference that organised sport plays in their lives. Coach Inderjeet Singh Sandhu and his team of volunteer team managers constantly teach the young players about the importance of consistency, dedication to improvement and doing their best, as well as self-confidence. The club includes both boys and girls, young men and young women in their teams, which are not divided on gender lines. With a stick in hand and training that emphasises teamwork, community service and good character, everybody can and does play hockey together. Both mums and dads contribute as umpires, team managers and club administrators, providing strong role models for the next generation of leaders. And on the theme of strong leaders, Deputy Speaker, I want to acknowledge a noteworthy event that takes place tomorrow night. That is a celebration of 20 years of service by Gina Dougal, CEO of the Banksia Gardens Community Services Neighbourhood House. Banksia Gardens is a dynamic neighbourhood house located in Broadmeadows in the southern end of my electorate. Gina Dougal has been at the helm for almost as long as I have been the federal member for Cornwall, so we've worked together for quite a significant period of time. Gina is a powerhouse of a community leader, inspiring, encouraging, energetic and innovative. She has built an incredible team of people, and together they have transformed Banksia Gardens into one of the largest neighbourhood houses in Victoria, with a suite of award-winning programs that challenge poverty, injustice and disadvantage in a radical and effective way. These programs include the Youth Justice Partnership, Project REAL and the Northern Centre for Excellence in School Engagement, Good People Act Now, youth-led action for gender equity, aiming high to support aspiring secondary school students and towards equality, supporting grassroots women's groups. Gina is one of the best-known community activists within the City of Hume, contributing to numerous boards, committees and organisations, as well as the incredible work she does leading Banksia Gardens. It is not common for someone to remain in such a challenging position in the community sector for so long, so I'm absolutely delighted to congratulate Gina Dougal on her 20-year commitment to our community that we both know and love and spend a lot of our working lives in. Congratulations, Gina, and here's to the next 20 years.
And I give the call to the member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. On behalf of the North Shore Country Club and Residents Association Incorporated, I wish to place on the parliamentary record my strong support for plans to redevelop the facility as a community hub, which will be accessible by all residents. The hub will be built on the existing community base of more than 600 residents through a program of community activities and events, including health and well-being programs, tennis, pickleball, fitness, Tai Chi and yoga. At a time when budget constraints make funding for community facilities extremely competitive, I have been working closely with members of the committee, including Phil Vinchulo, James Walsh, John Ingrams, Larry Hirsch, and the State Member for Hillary's Caitlin Collins MLA, to raise community awareness of the project, highlight the need for this facility in our community, and pursue funding sources. I organised a petition which has collected over 1,000 signatures, demonstrating strong local support. The community hub concept has also received support from champion Wimbledon tennis player and Moore resident Matt Ebden. The North Shore Estate in Callaroo was developed over 40 years ago. At the heart of the suburb is a small community facility built around a clubhouse, including tennis courts and catering for a thriving local community. The facility has long since outgrown its capacity, and the local Residents Association has advanced a proposal to extend and redevelop the ageing facilities to create a new, not-for-profit community hub. Extensive research has been undertaken to ascertain community needs, culminating in a strategic plan for the next 5 years, including indicative building plans for the redevelopment of the existing facility. The Community Hub recently hosted the popular Markets by the Sea event, bringing market stalls to the community with a day full of entertainment, which was well attended by hundreds of local families. A redeveloped North Shore Community Hub will be run by the community for the community. together with strong support from funding commitments from both the City of Joondalup and the WA State Government, a funding contribution from the federal government of $3 million is necessary to make this landmark project a reality. The North Shore Community Hub redevelopment has significant merit, and I wish to formally place on record my strong support for this project. I have written to the Minister for Sport on behalf of the Residents Association to progress this initiative in the budget process.
And I give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I'm glad to bring the voices of young people in my electorate into this place. As part of the Youth Voice in Parliament campaign, young people across Australia were invited to prepare a short speech on their vision for our future to be delivered by their Member of Parliament. I want to commend Ashley Streeter-Jones of Raise Our Voice on her powerful work in this campaign and note that as a result of her advocacy, more than 80 of my colleagues in this House and the other
division
place...
has been called in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or on subsequent divisions.
And I call the member for Fremantle in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I want to commend Ashley Streeter-Jones of Raise Our Voice on her powerful work in the Youth Voice in Parliament campaign. Note that as a result of her advocacy, more than 80 of my colleagues in this House and the other places speaking on behalf of young people from their part of Australia. My office received a number of excellent speeches from writers between the ages of 13 and 21 on topics including healthcare, disability access and the environment. I can tell you it was a very difficult choice to make, but the speech I've chosen to deliver in this place was written by 16-year-old Amelia Turk, who lives in Fremantle and is in Year 11 at John Curtin College of the Arts, which I attended a long time ago. Amelia already has a resume that's probably longer than mine. She's spoken in the WA Parliament, served as a youth board member for NGO Millennium Kids, and attended as a delegate the International Cooperation Forum in Geneva and the Stockholm Plus 50 International Meeting. Deputy Speaker, these are the words and vision of Amelia Turk. It's 2072 and COP77 is being held in Australia. The world is in awe, trying to comprehend the feat that Australia has achieved. It started with a change of heart, then a set of strict and ambitious targets, and then the change to achieve those targets. Australia is now a leading nation, a nation admired for taking action when it was called for. My name is Amelia Turk. I'm 16, I live in Fremantle, WA, and this is my dream. My dream is about the future, but it's also about today and the time in between. If you do not act today, my dream is unlikely to become reality. Australia's environment is steadily deteriorating. The State of the Environment Report 2021 confirmed this. It confirmed we need to take action now. We can't wait any longer. If Australia doesn't act now, it will be too late. If you, the current leaders of Australia, do not act now, you will leave this dire environment to us. If you do not act now, the future leaders of 2072 will have to deal with the consequences of today's choices, carrying the burden of inaction from half a century earlier. I ask you what you would prefer, for my dream to become a reality or the dire outcome to be cemented into our planet and for the consequences to be on show for all future generations. It's a very fair question that Amelia Turk poses, Deputy Speaker. It's a challenge for all of us in this place, and I thank Amelia, I thank all those right around Australia who have participated in the Youth Voices in Parliament initiative and contributed some fine words and some well-conceived visions of how Australia could be in more positive circumstances if we listen to the young people of Australia and do our jobs here.
And I call the member for Groom.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Last Saturday, Toowoomba's business community came together for its Night of Nights, the Focus HR Business Excellence Awards, organised by the Toowoomba Chamber of Commerce. It's a fantastic and well-earned celebration of our region's business community and a chance for business owners and leaders to reflect on their achievements over the last 12 months. It's no doubt been a challenging year on the back of a couple of challenging years with the pandemic, fires, floods, staff shortages affecting regional Queensland, but we've continued to see our business community locally adapt and overcome. They've successfully worked together under an initiative like the Chamber's Food and Agri Network to attract new visitors and investment to the region. I think people in Toowoomba understand better than most that business is an ecosystem, and the stronger that we can make that ecosystem, the greater the benefits are for all. Now, turning to the winners, the coveted 2022 Business of the Year went to Excavation Equipment, a local business servicing the earth-moving industry. Impressively, they were listed as finalists in 3 other categories, but ultimately took out the top gong. On top of their high-quality work servicing big clients across the nation, they're also well known for giving back to our local community, supporting a number of charity initiatives. X Factor Plumbing, a proud family-owned operation founded by Carl and Tiffany Ernst, received the 2022 CEO's Award. On the night, Todd Roll told the crowd that he picked X Factor Plumbing because they displayed the drive and passion of what it means to be a small business owner. He said their application of the award reminded him that, and I quote,
Order. A division has been called for the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed and at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
Mr. Chesters is rostered till...
And I call the member for Groom in continuation.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Well, Hogan's Family Jewellers have been inducted into the Hall of Fame for the Toowoomba Chamber of Commerce at the Business Excellence Awards last Saturday night. It's a fantastic recognition of a great Toowoomba business. And Hogan's story is the story of Toowoomba. After establishing in Leeton and Griffith in New South Wales in 1945, Jack and Madeline Hogan moved to the fantastic fertile ground of Toowoomba to commence trading in 1953. All 6 of their children worked in the store, and we're now down with Lockie Hogan, third generation, running the store now in Toowoomba. And they're experiencing what Toowoomba is experiencing at large. They're growing, Speaker. After 50 years at the one location, they're now expanding next door to 241 Margaret Street. The multi-million-dollar expansion will be open in the next 2 weeks. And their growth is representative of what's happening in our region. They're training, they're bringing in experience. Just this year, they trained both the Queensland Apprentice of the Year and the Queensland Junior Apprentice of the Year. They focus on building those skills, bringing them out to the regions and giving us that quality of workforce that we need. And very importantly, Speaker, they're exporting. Hogan's now have over 50% of their business going outside of Toowoomba. We see this with our airport, we see this with Inland Rail coming to us, the opportunities that we have as a region to really expand the great products produced in Toowoomba. It's a great demonstration of why our region is such a focal point for local business, why we're growing, why we're thriving. Congratulations to all the winners and a special congratulations to Hogan's Family Jewellers.
I call the member for Cowan.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to deliver a speech written by some young people in Cowan and as part of the Raise Our Voice program. And I want to deliver the first speech is by Leora Fletcher. And in response to the question, what should Australia's new parliament accomplish? I'm actually very honoured to be able to deliver this speech here in this place on behalf of Leora. And she says, as a 21-year-old woman, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak about topics I believe are important. Having said this, I'm aware I am not the only one with visions of how I would like Australia's governing body to look like, and this is a very good thing. Without the diversity of voices, the new parliament cannot truly represent all Australians. For this reason, it is absolutely crucial that the new parliament enshrines the voices of First Nations peoples in the Constitution to enable an empowered voice in the social, economic and spiritual matters which directly affect them. The Law Council of Australia describes this constitutionally enshrined voice as a manifestation of the right to self-determination, entitling people to have control of their destiny and to be treated respectfully. This change would be a positive step towards reconciliation, allowing a First Nations body to advise federal parliament on matters that disproportionately affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including native title, housing, heritage protection, employment and health. It makes sense for the people who have the best understanding of the challenges facing their families and communities to have a say in how best to address these. It is important to note that we are currently facing a climate crisis, and as recommended by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, consulting with Indigenous peoples can give rise to invaluable natural resource management strategies to mitigate climate disasters. There is no better time for cultural collaboration than now. An excellent example of this is Indigenous knowledge of cultural burn-offs to prevent catastrophe during bushfire season. We have seen the consequences of not implementing these burn-offs and knowledges too many times. This parliament should take action and pass legislation to hold a referendum and change the constitution and ensure an enshrined First Nations voice which cannot be undone. Well, thank you, Leora. I am proud to be able to read your words in Parliament and to assure you that this government takes your voice seriously and takes the measures that you've suggested seriously. And we will be taking this to a referendum. And Leora, I look forward to meeting you and discussing these issues further.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Higgins.
The power of place cannot be underestimated to a people who were unmoored and adrift for thousands of years. The 14 million Jewish diaspora, of which I have 6,500 in Higgins, are anchored to Israel. If Israel is the homeland, then Jerusalem is its beating heart. At the confluence of Christianity, Islam and Judaism, Jerusalem is significant, not just to the Jewish people, but to humanity. My Jewish constituents are hurt following the announcement of our government's position with respect to Jerusalem. Falling on a Jewish holiday only added insult to injury, for which I am sorry. A departure from our government's usual consultative approach was unfortunate because it heaped additional distress onto a community that is grappling with rising levels of anti-Semitism. There is no place for anti-Semitism. To feel threatened while walking the streets or studying at university or being inexplicably passed up for promotion are the spillover effects of hate. Confronting anti-Semitism is our collective responsibility. Actions matter. The teaching of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in our workplaces, schools, universities and sporting clubs is a good place to start. Education also demands an understanding of apartheid. I grew up in Zambia when apartheid was in full swing. Even as a child, I knew full well what it meant for millions of people with the same skin colour as me. I rile at descriptors of Israel in that light. Australia's ties with Israel trace back to its birth. Labor Attorney-General Doc Everett in the Curtin government played a key role in establishing the State of Israel. His contribution led to the 1947 UN Partition Plan, which Australia was the first country to vote yes for. Having a homeland is good, but it is not enough. Peace and security is a prerequisite to thriving, and this is at the heart of the Albanese government's position. We will support, not undermine, negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian people because peace is a worthy prize. The stability peace brings allows the tree of life to send deep its roots, grow branches that stretch into the sky, providing refuge for all. Labor has always maintained, as have successive governments over 70 years, including the Gorton, Howard, Abbott and Turnbull governments, that Jerusalem is a final status issue that should be resolved as part of peace negotiations. Labor does not shuffle embassies around for political expediency, nor do we make foreign policy decisions because there is a by-election to win. That Israel has thrived with so much stacked against it, from a paucity of rainfall, arable land and continuous hostility, is testament to its culture of innovation. It offers us in Australia the blueprint of how to do more with less. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the very busy member for Clark.
The panting member for Clark. How long, Deputy Speaker, do Tasmanians have to put up with a health system that is consistently failing to deliver on so many different fronts? Barely a day goes by without constituents relating health horror stories, such as that of a 90-year-old man who spent 3.5 hours waiting in agony on the floor for an ambulance to arrive to triage his broken leg and to transport him to hospital. His pain and distress grew exponentially as time wore on, with a few Panamax the only relief available until paramedics arrived. Then there's the parents of a 3-year-old boy with autism who had to move interstate at a moment's notice to access the care he needs because it's just not available in Tasmania. They couldn't afford to wait up to 18 months to see an allied health professional, as early intervention is crucial. And I quote them, "The entire industry is in crisis mode," says the child's mother, who was not only forced to leave behind a senior job in the healthcare sector, but also the family's entire support network. And what advice, Deputy Speaker, do you suggest we give to the growing number of constituents whose GP has retired and they can't find another local practice to take them on, let alone one that bulk bills? As a result, many delay seeing a doctor until their condition worsens and lands them in the already overloaded emergency department. Meanwhile, those healthcare workers at the coalface have struggled through difficult conditions for so long that their goodwill is exhausted. Facing inevitable burnout, they too are forced to move to another state where both the conditions and the pay are so much better. While the rollout of Medicare urgent care clinics and reform to the GP sector are clearly welcome, they are just one part of the puzzle, and with so many GPs already leaving the sector and graduates choosing other specialties well ahead of general practice, just who is going to staff these urgent care clinics? What we have here is a system that clearly needs rebuilding from the ground up. Without serious reforms in the primary healthcare system, including a long overdue increase in the Medicare rebate, the situation is only going to get worse. Deputy Speaker, until the Medicare rebate rises, making healthcare affordable for patients and ensuring GPs achieve pay parity with colleagues working in hospitals, the GP workforce will continue to contract, sick people will continue to wait longer for treatment, and the acute care system will continue to bear the burden. Deputy Speaker, the time has come to implement serious systemic change, with a particular focus on expanding allied health roles in the community to ease the pressure on both primary and acute care sectors. Until we do this, these horror stories are set to continue. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded. Clerk.
Government business, statement number 1, further statements on floods.
Are there any statements?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Like many others in this place, communities in my electorate have recently been dealing with severe weather, storms and flooding. Flooding occurred across the Meander Valley, Northern Midlands, Kentish, Break of Day and Central Highlands local government municipalities. While the weather has eased over recent weeks, the impacts of the floods are ongoing as clean-up and repairs continue. I recently spent time in these communities, including with the Prime Minister, inspecting damage and discussing with communities ways in which the Albanese government can help get things back on track. We know people need support and we will do everything in our power to help. The Prime Minister spoke in the last sitting in the House about his recent visits to flood-affected areas in Australia, including Deloraine. The Meander River flooded rapidly and higher than ever before. The people of Deloraine this time had prior warning. Unfortunately, through quick action and planning, no human life was lost, and families were able to evacuate before waters rose. And from my discussions with farmers and primary producers, livestock losses were minimal, though of course there was quite a lot of agricultural damage in terms of seeds and new plantings. Businesses and some houses in Deloraine were badly affected. Mick and the team at Highland Haulage were one of the worst impacted businesses in the town, with floodwaters entering their warehouse and rising above the height of anyone standing in this place if we were on the ground floor. I spoke with Mick, and all he wanted to talk about was how lucky he was compared to others. Generous, community-minded, thinking of others before himself. Pictures were also shown nationwide of a storage container full of possessions of a family in Deloraine that had floated down the river. Such was the strength of these floods. Unfortunately, that family lost everything in the container. Such was the water damage. The container itself was secured before it hit the bridge in Deloraine, which connects the east and west of the town. Across town at the Footy Oval, the Deloraine Football Club was once again left to clean up after club rooms were flooded for the third time in 11 years, in what are supposedly 100-year floods. It tells us something, Deputy Speaker. Climate change is real, the impacts are real, the increasing severity is real. I thank the Prime Minister for visiting the club with me on 19 October, where he heard firsthand the issues that they are facing and what is needed to protect the community from future flood events. And I look forward to continuing to work with the club and the council on those plans. Still in the Meander Valley, in Meander and Hadspen, the Meander River and South Esk River broke their banks, forcing the community to evacuate and do their best to protect property with sandbags and other measures. It is at this point I would like to highlight the work of the local council, community groups and members of the community for their contribution in response to the floods. And thank you to the council workers, the emergency services workers, the SES and other volunteers who acted tirelessly throughout days and nights to ensure people remain safe and sound. And of course to the power workers who work for TasNetworks and Aurora, who keep the power poles active and the electricity on during the worst of weather. In the Kentish municipality in the northwest of my electorate, flooding impacted the town of Sheffield and the town of Railton, and I joined the former mayor, Tim Wilson, not the former member for Goldstein, people will be relieved to hear, in Sheffield last week to discuss those flood events. We travelled to Railton and we visited the local post office. While floodwaters did breach sandbagging attempts and seep through and into the floor, like most houses in the area, stock and furniture was able to be lifted off the ground beforehand and no great damage was sustained, unlike earlier floods. While in Kentish, I spoke with the Mayor about flood mitigation plans that do have federal support. These plans continue to be developed in consultation with the community and it is hoped they can begin soon. Whilst travelling the north of my electorate and visiting flood-affected communities, my travels also saw me head to the Break of Day municipality in the north-east, where I visited St Helens. There, residents told me of the measures they took to get through the deluge from the floods and the impact that it's had on roads. A journey that would normally take me 2 hours took 6 due to landslips, floods and other diversions in the area. Across my electorate, many others found themselves isolated until floodwaters receded. Once I finally arrived in the Northern Midlands, it was clear too they had not escaped, with the South Esk River in full flood, breaking its banks and providing a constant threat to neighbouring properties. The township of Poatina continues to be affected, with roads still closed. Deputy Speaker, it was clear during these visits that the communities have received a great amount of support from locals, their councils, their emergency service authorities and neighbouring communities, who themselves have avoided flood devastation, but still wanted to help out their fellow Tasmanians. It was also clear that support was needed from the federal government to help get these communities back on track following these floods. I was proud to host the Prime Minister and the Minister for Emergency Management, Senator Murray Watt, in Tasmania to witness the effects of these floods firsthand and to meet the people who helped deal with them. The Prime Minister also visited Latrobe in the neighbouring electorate of Braddon. And Deputy Speaker, it is why the federal government, in conjunction with the Tasmanian government, announced disaster assistance for flood-impacted communities in Tasmania. In total, 17 local government municipalities are eligible for assistance, including 5 in Lyons. Assistance is being provided through the jointly funded Commonwealth State Disaster Recovery Funding Arrangements, and that provides assistance of up to $1,000 and emergency accommodation assistance for individuals or families who have been directed or advised by a relevant authority to evacuate from their residence or displaced from their residence due to flooding.
Order. A division has been called in the House. Proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume in the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. I call the member for Lyons in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I also note that financial institutions offer hardship provisions to delay repayments of loans and mortgages when circumstances such as these do arise. And Deputy Speaker, one of the other things available to people in my community, other than the disaster recovery funding of $1,000 for families and individuals, is up to $25,000 for small businesses and primary producers, and a number of eligibility criteria do apply. So I encourage small businesses and primary producers in my electorate to contact my office and we can provide the details of how to access those grants. Deputy Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Prime Minister and the Minister for Emergency Management for their visit to these affected communities and for their work in providing support to those who need it most at this time. I am proud to be a member of a government that responds to support communities affected by such significant natural disasters. And I'm sorry to say, it looks like we're going to have more of these natural disasters more often and increasingly severe. That's what the experts tell us, and that's certainly what's being borne out by recent events. But that's what being in government's about, providing support and delivering for the community. Deputy Speaker, I'm incredibly proud of the support the Lions community always shows to each other during tough times, and I'm so thankful that no loss of human life was recorded in Tasmania during these floods. Discussions have already commenced about ways we can further improve flood mitigation and stop these devastating events from taking such a continuous toll on our communities. Climate change cannot be ignored here. We've been warned about it, about more frequent and severe weather events, and they are happening. They're not happening in the future. They're not being talked about in the future. They are happening right now. They are here. You can't turn a blind eye and pretend it's not real. We've had a decade of that nonsense, and it's time to get rid of it and start dealing with the reality we face. The evidence is in every flooded river, every broken house, every shattered business. I look forward to participating in these discussions and working with all levels of government, of all colours and kinds of government, because this is cross-party, this is not political, we need to find solutions. So I look forward to working with everybody that I can to provide better protection and support to local communities. Deputy Speaker, Tasmanians came out in force during these events to help each other. The support that communities have shown, especially the volunteers, people, there's nothing in it for them. They just turn out day and night in the most appalling of weather, put themselves at risk to help others in need, and that is a testament, of course, not just to people in my state, my electorate, but people across the country, and none more so, than I must say, than across regional communities. I know the member for Riverina will agree with me on this, that people in regional communities look out for each other when times are tough, and certainly with these floods and these disasters, for many communities it's never been tougher. We need to be there for them. This government will be there for them. We are there for them now, and we'll never stop making sure that we can do whatever we can to support them in their time of need. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Are there any statements? And I call the member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and to some points I do agree with the member for Lyons. The fact is we need to do more, and I'm hoping that the federal government, in conjunction with the states, can do more, particularly when it comes to building the necessary water infrastructure for flood mitigation. Building dams is not, of course, just about flood mitigation, and there is a great expectation, a great commitment and a great obligation indeed on states to get on board with the Commonwealth and build water infrastructure. I know the New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet has had a bit to say, a lot to say, as he needs to, about Warragamba Dam. And if it is good enough for the people who live in the shadow of Warragamba Dam to have that piece of water infrastructure raised for flood mitigation, it must be good enough for the people who live downstream from Wyangla Dam. Now, Forbes has been flooded, on average, every 7 years since 1887. 6 times, if you count twice this year, in the past 12 years. And yet there seems to be some sort of reluctance to, in fact, commit the necessary funding for Wyangla Dam to be raised by 10 metres, which would provide an additional 650 gigalitres of capacity for that dam. 650 gigalitres. Imagine the agriculture you could grow from that. But not just that, it would also help in the event of flooding. Now, we mourned the loss of little Jaden Elgia, just 5 years old, in September, who was caught up in flash flooding near Tullamore. We grieve for his family. We mourn his loss, and it serves as a tragic reminder of the ferocity of floods. It serves as a poignant reminder to the fact that we cannot replace human lives lost in these flooding events. Forbes has a very resilient community. I was pleased that Prime Minister Albanese visited the town along with Premier Perrottet. In fact, it was Premier Perrottet's second visit. He was there late last year in November with Scott Morrison, then Prime Minister, to look at the situation. Prime Minister Albanese was there on 17 October. He was there with the Murray Watt, the Emergency Services Minister, Emergency Management Minister. He was there with myself, of course, with Steph Cook, who is the not only the Emergency Management Minister in New South Wales, but also the Minister for Resilience and Flood Recovery, most importantly. And I said to the Premier then that the state needs to come on board and raise Wyangla Dam. Now, since that press conference, since that visit by the Prime Minister and Premier, the Lachlan River at Forbes peaked at 10.67 metres on Saturday, 5 November, just below the June 1952 flood level of 10.8. Now, the 52 flood, I'm reliably told by Bruce Adams, a long-time Forbes resident, was a bit of an aberration because they built a levee bank near Red Bend, near the Catholic College there, which built up the water, and then the integrity of the new structure gave way and sent almost a tsunami, sent quite a wave through the town, and that caused a lot of hardship. And of course, it caused the river level, which is generally done at the Iron Bridge, to reach a record height. The waters went through the CBD. This time, farmers again copped the brunt of it. The many farmers throughout the Riverina and Central West, particularly around Forbes and Wagga Wagga, have lost crops. Not so much livestock, they've been able to get those to higher ground because of the warnings given, but have lost a lot of cropping, and that's devastating for those farmers, hoping for a good season, worried about the fact that the ground, which was already saturated, would prevent them from getting their heavy harvesting gear into the paddocks, but then to have their crops just waterlogged and ruined is a bitter blow that they just didn't need. The Murrumbidgee River at Wagga Wagga peaked at 9.72 metres on Friday, 4 November. Again, very pleased that State Water, and I will give them some credit, they got their mathematics right and minimised the flood damage. And I know they cop a lot of criticism, and I know a lot of people think that Blowering and Burrinjuck and other water infrastructure are there for, if not hydroelectricity, then flood mitigation. We forget sometimes that dams were built for actual irrigators. We forget sometimes that if they let the water go too soon, there's no water for the irrigation season, which is later in the year, and those irrigators pay handsomely, pay dearly for that water. And the necessity to let the water go at the right time, so as not to upset the irrigators, let the water go at the right time, so as not to cause perhaps floods later on, is a fine balance, a delicate balance, and the State Water, I have to say, have managed it reasonably well, given the fact that a lot of properties were not inundated. The levee around North Wagga it didn't top that important bank, and many people inside the levee at North Wagga were saved, even though they had to be evacuated, and that, of course, causes distress, it causes a logistical nightmare, and it causes heartache for many. But better to evacuate and take the authorities' orders than hope, stay at home, refuse to budge, and then have your house inundated and potential tragedy. And I would urge again and encourage people, and we're expecting another 60 to 70 millimetres, so the forecast tells us, in the not too distant future, potentially even this weekend, that people adhere to the warnings given by our authorities. Now, Rocky Walshaw at Forbes and Ben Pickup at Wagga Wagga have been great leaders in these flood events. but people still don't follow instructions and still drive through floodwaters and still drive through swollen creeks and still disobey road signs. They are there for a reason. Local governments don't put signs out closing roads just for no good reason. They do it because they care for people. They do it because they want people to stay safe, and yet people still defy logic, they still defy orders given, and then they still have to then be rescued because they're on the phone ringing 132 500, the SES, or ringing 000, and after they get themselves in trouble. It makes no sense. Now, I do want to pay tribute to some people who, and look, there's been so many people who volunteered their time and effort to provide sandbagging. I was doing some along with Trish and Greg Wright, Janet Thompson at Wagga Wagga. I know the fine staff at Bunnings, Wagga Wagga, with their red shirts, little hammers on them, left the shop. No doubt they were given the green light to do so, but they were enthusiastically getting in there and did it for hour upon hour upon hour. And well done to them. Well done to everybody who volunteered, both at Wagga Wagga. I know the same was the case at Forbes. I know Annette St Clair was there, and these people, let's just say with all due respect to them, are not young. Many of them are not young. They're not as fit as they'd like to be, and yet they were getting out there and hour upon hour shoveling sand into sandbags for strangers they'll probably never meet. People they'll never know, but pitching in and doing their bit. And in the worst of times, Speaker, you see the best of people, the best of Australians. That mateship quality really shines through. But look, there is an expectation on the state to come on board with us and build water infrastructure. Excuses, forget them. I mean, I know they wanted $325 million from the Commonwealth to raise Wyangla Dam Wall. We gave it to them as a loan, which they asked for. Then they wanted a grant. We complied. Then it became $1 billion. Now it's potentially $2 billion. I say, so what? It's an investment in our future. It's an investment in agriculture. It's an investment in not having the Newell Highway closed. It's an investment in making sure that Forbes does not get flooded. They are the forgotten people at Forbes. They shouldn't put up with being second best. Good enough for Warragamba people who live in the shadow of that fine piece of water infrastructure near Sydney, then good enough for Forbes. Let's make sure that...
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. And I call the member for Riverina.
Thanks to the volunteers, the first responders, defence personnel for your help, flood-affected farmers and businesses for your resilience, and I call on governments to fund the Wyangla Dam wall raising right now.
Are there any statements? I call the member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, my electorate of Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast is no stranger to floods. In fact, one of my very first memories as a 4-year-old was being evacuated from my family's dairy farm, along with community members, on the back of a truck into nearby Nowra. Back then, I thought it was sort of an adventure. But fast forward half a century, and over the last 3+ years, communities in my electorate have gone through more than 14 disaster-declared floods since the bushfires alone. I think it's safe to say that the compounding nature of drought, bushfires, floods and the pandemic has caused an extreme, prolonged fatigue that we have not seen before. Flood fatigue, disaster fatigue, recovery fatigue. Deputy Speaker, we are a resilient lot on the South Coast, but even we have our limits on what we can deal with. 14 disaster-declared floods, and not every rain event has even been declared a disaster, but so many disaster-declared floods in a little over 3 years is about one flood every 3 or 4 months. The immediate impact of floods on our community is huge. Homes inundated, businesses left to clean up or ruined, public infrastructure damaged or destroyed. The ongoing strain on livestock, farmers losing countless stock and watching their paddocks, their livelihoods turned into sogging grounds and lakes. Every time there is a major flood event, our farmers spring into action, moving their cattle, making sure they are safe and on high ground. It's no easy task, but they do it time and time again. damaged and cut off roads that are impacting every single person who lives in our communities and every single person that visits us. And it is one of the biggest complaints I hear every day from local people. When are the roads getting fixed? Every time it feels like we have made progress, back we go again with more rain or another flood. This is particularly true for communities who are either completely or partially cut off because of landslides, roads that have either fallen away or are completely covered in debris. The communities of Jamberoo, Kangaroo Valley, Upper Kangaroo River, Burrier, Wadamolla, Woodhill Mountain, Barangarry, Brogers Creek have been hit particularly hard, but really the list goes on and on. All isolated communities, one road in and one road out for many of them, and at times they have been completely cut off. Sometimes completely, sometimes with restrictions like load limits or residents only, but impacting on the lives of local people every day. These areas are absolutely beautiful, but in many places the terrain is difficult. Much of the land is farmland, but many people have also developed beautiful Airbnbs up there or run other sorts of businesses. There's also a lot of people who have decided this is the place for them to retire and live among the trees. Idyllic, but now proving somewhat difficult. Without road access, even simple things become incredibly difficult. I have visited many of these communities to hear about the daily impact the landslips are having. I'm regularly speaking with those impacted and their stories are just heartbreaking. You've got farmers who have had to chopper in feed, paid for out of their own pocket because they didn't know how else they would feed their stock. These communities have been cut off completely for weeks or months at a time. Even once the roads have partially reopened, the load limits are causing some of the biggest headaches for local farmers. Farmers need heavy equipment to come in and out to allow them to operate. Feed, livestock, silage equipment, you name it. Most don't have that equipment just sitting on their properties. They need to bring it in. When they can't run their farms. One farmer told me recently he was going to have to walk 30 head of cattle across the slip to move them on, a very normal and regular practice for farmers. It's making it extremely difficult for residents to get to work, kids to get to school, and for businesses to operate. It's stifling the local economy, not to mention the fact that it keeps tourists away at a time when they have never been needed more. But it isn't quite that simple. I've been working closely with the local councils on this, but the logistical operation of getting these roads back open is incredibly difficult. The Australian government has provided millions of dollars in assistance to local councils for repair works under the disaster recovery funding arrangements. But with so much complicated damage spread over such a large area, council is struggling to get the technical and physical resources needed. That's not to mention the continuous rain, which continues to cause further landslips and further instability. There is no easy answer. I know that our local councils are taking every step necessary to get these roads open as quickly as possible, and I commend them for that. But I can also understand how the slow progress is frustrating for local people. Deputy Speaker, even outside of these communities, the rain is playing havoc with our roads. The Shoalhaven has one of the longest local road networks in the country. The constant rain pummelling our roads has left them in an atrocious state. Potholes the size of sinkholes are just everywhere, and local people are sick of it. Every time I speak with anyone, the word potholes never takes too long to creep in. Deputy Speaker, on top of the significant funds that have been provided for immediate recovery under the disaster recovery funding arrangements and the $1 million that was provided to every flood-impacted council back in July, I am also doing all I can to support repairs to our roads. I'm delighted to have delivered $40 million to help Shoalhaven City Council with local road repairs as part of the federal budget. The Australian government has also provided a $250 million top-up to the Local Roads and Community Infrastructure Program, taking the total size of the program to $3.25 billion. I know this will make a huge difference to our local councils. Our councils are working through this. They are doing their best, and I thank them for that hard work. Rather than being an issue of money, it's an issue of resources. That pesky worker shortage we are experiencing nationwide, and I know the councils are working on this too. We will get there. Deputy Speaker, the businesses in Kangaroo Valley have also suffered through a long period of financial strain because of the indirect impact of the floods. The damaged roads, as I mentioned, kept tourists away, kept their customers away for months. The circumstances facing this community were unique. For months, I had called for a targeted small business support program to address these unique circumstances. Those requests fell on deaf ears under the former government, but I was absolutely thrilled to deliver that support in August with the $1 million Kangaroo Valley Road Closure Small Business Grant. This was so needed and so welcome. I'm really pleased that a lot of local small businesses benefited from this grant, but I was appalled at the very poor way the New South Wales government has administered it, with many local businesses unfortunately telling me they missed out because the process was simply too hard. This just isn't good enough, and I have asked the New South Wales Minister to fix this. I will keep doing everything I can to support this wonderful community. Deputy Speaker, we have a long way to go in our flood recovery. We are also still recovering from the bushfires and the pandemic. But I know we will get there, and I will continue working closely across our community and across government to ensure that we are getting the help we deserve.
Are there any statements? I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The term hero gets bandied about a lot. Sometimes it is well and truly deserved. The past week and a half, the floods that have been impacting the regions of Mallee and lapping at the doors of many communities in Mallee have seen heroes arise. I've heard from people in Charlton still traumatised from the 2011 floods. I've heard from people such as Prue Millgate, who has a farm on the banks of the Loddon River at Serpentine. More than 98% of the Millgate farm was inundated by floods. I've heard from business owners in Bridgewater who have had to rebuild after their shops were affected. 9 of my 12 LGAs are impacted, and there will be more as floodwaters encroach further in these next weeks. In these communities, there are heroes. People who stand up for their community no matter what the situation and just roll up their sleeves and get the work done. They don't want to be known as heroes, though. Mallee people are like that. They're tough and resourceful, but they don't look for the accolades or the praise. They just act in the best interests of their community. People like John McConville, or Mr. Donald, as he's also known. John is a typical hard worker, and in Donald, he has his finger in many pies and the pulse on the needs of the community. He's the kind of person that doesn't command respect, he simply gets it. Even 5 minutes talking with him, I know he deserves it. John led a team of locals recently to build a levee in the township of Donald that saved businesses and homes from being inundated. He and his team didn't wait for help, they just did it themselves. In the Gunnewarra Shire, Jeff Rollinson is the council's acting CEO, also known as Rollo. It's a paid position, but he's going over and above. He's taking the lead and proactively leading his community through some of the toughest times they have faced. Places like Kerrang, Kundruk, Murrabit, Kahuna, Benjaroop. I spoke with residents there and they couldn't speak more highly of Rollo, someone they can trust. Sometimes local government officers get the rough end of the stick from their communities, but Rollo has earned respect through his actions. In times that require your leaders to step up, Rollo has. Our SES and CFA volunteers, along with paid emergency services such as the Victoria Police and ambulance services, are also the heroes in this unfolding story. Stretched thin as it is, they consistently continue to put their community above themselves. I sat in a community meeting at Carisbrook a couple of weeks ago for a debrief following their flood event. It was a room full of emotion, and it was local SES Commander Darren Cooper, a volunteer himself, facing the brunt of it. He and his colleagues were not only took the responsibility as the SES for the town of Carisbrook, they were also providing SES support for Central Goldfields Shire region. And with limited resources, including a scarcity of operational boots-on-the-ground volunteers, they did their best to ensure their communities were safe. In Newbridge, amid the sodden ruins of a multi-million-dollar sporting complex, I met 3 women: Kay Graham, Colleen Young and Sue Horsley. They are members of the Newbridge Recreation Reserve Committee of Management. While the Recreation Reserve was hit hard by floods, their strength and optimism was inspirational. Colleen herself proved a heroine in the truest definition. Not that she wanted that title, but her actions could only be described as heroic. The night the floods hit Newbridge, they had 40 young men camping by the river on a bucks party. Naturally, these men were all focused on partying, and as they were in their swags, they were in immediate danger. Colleen ensured they got to higher ground as the floodwaters rose during the night. It is troubling to think what might have happened had she not been there to help these men. As I said at the start of this speech, the term hero does get bandied about a lot, but I have found in Mallee we have many heroes, and these are just some. I want to speak briefly about the currently unfolding flood emergencies going on in the Swan Hill LGA and also the Mildura region. We're looking at Swan Hill and Mildura and Robinvale, in fact, hitting major flood levels in this week and next couple of weeks. Boundary Bend is also expected to exceed major flood levels this Saturday. Now, the last major flood level we had was in 1956. Also in the 70s, we had high flood levels. This is deeply concerning, but I've got to give all credit to the SES and the CFA, the local councils, of course, who are monitoring these situations and providing recommendations and working with local communities, having local knowledge. And, you know, we have a long way to go yet. Some of these floods in the past have taken months to actually recede. We will have highways closed. We currently have 450 roads in Victoria closed right now. This is creating a headache for transport companies, for locals trying to get to work. Many people can't get to work. I'm really pleased to see both the Victorian government and the federal government providing the financial support. I also commend the Minister for Emergency Services, Murray Watt, Senator for Queensland, for his engagement as I've been able to call him and talk with him through the needs and the funding resources that are required for my 9 LGAs. He and his office have been very responsive, and I thank him for that. So as we go into these next few weeks, I know people in Mildura, people in Swan Hill, Robinvale are going to be feeling the same anxieties as Kerrang and Benjaroop and Kundruk and others down in Carisbrook have been feeling over this last month and a half. Together, we understand that we will get through this and the supports will be provided. And I would encourage anyone in my electorate who is needing support over this next week to contact my office and we can direct them to the appropriate supports. Thank you.
Are there any members' statements? I call the member for Parkes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today in the Australian Parliament to speak about the floods that are impacting the eastern side of Australia at the moment. The Parkes electorate encompasses 30% of the Murray-Darling Basin, and I guess the easiest way to go through this might be to actually go through the different river systems. And so the Lachlan River in the southern part of my electorate, at the moment there's a flood peak heading towards Condobolin. It's the water that's been coming down through Forbes and the town of Condobolin, and further down Lake Kajiligo, and the communities in that area and the farmers in that area are bracing for a major flood in that area. The Bogan River, which is normally a very small, not more than a depression in the ground, is now adding significantly to the water into the system. And so the Bogan River starts sort of in around the back of Parkes, the town of Parkes, and finds its way into the Darling River just east of Burke. And at the moment it's contributing large amounts, and there's been significant flooding along that Bogan system and crop losses as well. The Macquarie River at the moment has been flooded several times. We've seen significant flood damage in and around Dubbo. I actually had a group of school students from Narromine, and they've only just gone back to regular lessons with kids actually attending school on the backs of tractors because they can't actually get into town through the flood water. And further downstream from Narromine at Warren, they've been poised with extra pumps in place in case the levee bank breaches or overtops. At the moment, the township of Warren has been secure, but the significant damage, road damage and crop damage in that Macquarie and that lower Macquarie area as the water spreads out before it finds its way through the Macquarie marshes and ultimately into the Bow and Darling up between Brewarrina and Walgett. If you keep going through the Castlereagh, just a bit of trivia, Castlereagh starts flowing east, it flows south, it flows west and ends up flowing north. And it also finds its way into the Bow and Darling up around Brewarrina. But at the moment, there's been significant flooding, and a lot of the in between these rivers, there's creek systems that are actually spreading out. So the full extent of the crop losses is not known yet, but it'll be in the billions across the area. And so the Namoi River. Houses in Gunnedah have been inundated several times. The village of Carroll has been evacuated. Narrabri has seen flooding in the lower areas, and Weewaw has been isolated for weeks at a time. And we are seeing significant crop losses in the Namoi Valley. That flood peak now is west of Weewaw, and it's causing significant harm in that area as it makes its way to Walgett. Walgett at the moment is completely isolated. I was speaking to the general manager there. Some of the Aboriginal villages on the edge of Walgett are inundated. The houses are on stilts, but there is water under those houses. They are having issues with the sewerage pumps in some of those villages. In Namoi Village, I think is the main one. They have got them restored, but they're watching that very, very closely in case they have to evacuate those communities. So Walgett is completely surrounded, and significant crop losses in that come by chance Walgett and further west as we go into that. The Gwydir, major flooding, one of the record floods. I live very close to the Gwydir. It's the biggest flood I've seen in my life. And at the moment, the Moree Plains Shire are predicting 120,000 hectares of crops lost just in the Moree Plains. And so, thankfully, Senator Watt is coming to Moree tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to letting him see firsthand not only the inundation. I think there was a couple of hundred houses in Moree that had water in them, but so he can talk to some of the farmers as well as about the crop losses. And if you move further north into the border rivers, the McIntyre River is causing significant issues, and it has done for some time. And all that water congregates sort of when you get into the west, towns like Mungandai, Cut Off, Weemala, Garrar, and the issue is all that water gets in then to the Darling system. And so we're seeing, out of bank river now at Burke. There's a peak's just gone through Tilpa. I know, speaking to the folks at Killara Station, have lost thousands of acres of crop that was on the point of harvest, which is devastating for them. There's not many grain growers in the far west, but the Killara Station is a significant operation, and they've had major damage. And so we're seeing that water work its way down through the system. And I think, as a word of warning, we just heard from the member for Mallee talking about the flood in Victoria and the Murray system. South Australia needs to be bracing for a major, major flood. Hopefully the Murray water might make its way through before the water coming down the Darling gets there, but already houses have been evacuated at Menindee, and there's 2 or 3 flood peaks coming down the river to Menindee that will put further stress on the system. The lakes are full. They're actually over full in many cases, and I flew over them on Sunday on my way to Canberra, and there's certainly a lot of water in the far west. The losses are significant. The inconvenience is great. But in the overall scheme of things, in the far west particularly, that's probably just what they needed, and that refurbishment and the replenishment of that far western part of the country with the Darling spilling out into Tallywalka and other major waterways that haven't seen this sort of inundation for a long time will really help refresh that area. But there's a lot of hardship attached to it. So I just want to pay tribute to the mayors. There's 18 council areas in my electorate, and the mayors have shown great leadership in all cases, and the volunteers, obviously. But I think, I've been in this job, I'm looking at the member for Maribyrnong, 15 years in a couple of weeks. And I've got to say, I think this is the greatest level of cooperation between the three levels of government in a disaster that I've seen. And so I'm not hearing much complaint about the processes that have been put in place. People have been around long enough to know that they will suffer hardship in a flood. But I just want to commend the ministers at all levels, the mayors, and then the volunteers on the ground that are doing such a mighty job for such a long time. And this is not over. La Nina is predicted to stick around for a bit longer, but I can tell you, I think the people in my electorate are looking for a bit of sunshine. Thank you.
Are there any statements? I call the member for Maribyrnong.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Australians understand that we now live with a reality of natural disasters dominating our news cycle. Where once upon a time there might have been a season for floods or a season for bushfires, it is now a constant concern. Now, if we only see the coverage of these matters on television, we count ourselves lucky. But as I stand in the Parliament of Australia today, I am deeply aware and moved by the fact that there are thousands of our fellow Australians who are trying to rebuild after weeks of catastrophic inundation and indeed continue the rebuilding process from previous flood events. It is true to say that in times of tragedy and crisis, Australians like to believe that we help each other. This is actually true. Adam Lindsay Gordon famously talked about courage in one's own trouble and kindness in another's. This was an ethos that emerged in the 19th century, but I pleasingly believe it remains true today. Our government believes that this is what we should do. It is our fundamental role to support Australians when they are in need. So my remarks today initially will be about my Department of Services Australia, who've been on the front line of efforts to assist flood-affected communities across Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania in the most recent events. We activated the Australian Government Disaster Recovery Payment and the Disaster Recovery Allowance in response to the September and October flooding. Since then, I can report to Australians that Services Australia has answered more than 22,000 calls for assistance, processed more than 42,000 claims for emergency payments, made payments of almost $44 million to support more than 53,000 Australians. Hundreds of Services Australia staff have been redeployed to help individuals and families get back on their feet. We've had dedicated Commonwealth public servants on the ground in 11 different locations. We've sent mobile service centres, the one-stop shop Service Australia buses to Victoria and Tasmania. Staff will stay as long as they are required. And because those impacted by floods often require more than emergency monetary assistance, the Services Australia social workers have provided help to almost 2,000 of our fellow Australians in dealing with the life-changing consequences of these terrible disasters. The commitment to help Australians impacted by natural disaster is also reflected in last month's budget. Extra funding and workforce will ensure that Services Australia continues to support the community during emergencies over the next year and in its planning and response to future emergencies, because we know they will come. There is funding for more than 2,100 additional staff in this financial year which we're in. This will enable the agency to continue digital customer service delivery and on-the-ground mobile support whenever, wherever Australians need it. There will also be an extra 200 staff recruited to support our customer services safety net Australia-wide. These additional staff will go to where the need is, including regional and remote Australia, to support customers experiencing vulnerability. Up in the far north, 100 Services Australia staff will be progressively recruited to be based in Cairns. And $2.4 million, courtesy of the lobbying of the formidable member for Lyons, has been allocated to increase service delivery staff and services in Sorell and Tasmania in our south. Because we know that natural disasters are a direct consequence of climate change, there was $9.3 million in the budget for a Commonwealth Climate Risk and Opportunity Management Program. This is going to allow successive governments to improve the policies, programs, services delivered to the Australian community to address the challenge of climate change.
Order. A division having been called for in the House, the proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
Okay, I call a member for Maribyrnong and continuation.
My own electorate and neighbouring areas that I've been fortunate and privileged enough to represent for nearly 15 years were amongst the communities to feel the impact of the most recent flooding inundations in Victoria. The Maribyrnong River breached its banks. It will take some time for our area to recover. I visited flood-affected areas in the local government areas of Maribyrnong and Moonee Valley on the day of the flooding and the days after. It was actually shocking. The sedate river, usually a place for the gathering of recreation and exercise, park runs and football and netball, had become a stranger. It was a menacing presence. The river was wide. Mini lakes were created across football ovals and netball fields. The pace of the river, the momentum, a threat to homes and businesses, lives and livelihoods. The flood high tide marks halfway up interior and exterior walls only tell part of the story. It's the disgusting sludge. It's the debris that covers floors and yards. It's the stench of ruined carpets and furniture that fills the air. The piles of hard rubbish on the footpaths surrounding the houses were a constant reminder on those days and for weeks thereafter of the full extent of the work ahead that is only revealed once the water retreats. But I'm pleased to say that as the water receded, it was replaced by a remarkable determination of the community to triumph over adversity. These were residents, many of whom were affected by the floods themselves, who put everything aside to help their neighbours, especially those who are elderly, those who are not able to get around on their own or without support networks. It's the local school communities of St Margaret's and Moonee Ponds West primary schools reaching out and helping the families of their children enrolled there. There were people like my very good friend Judy Ingram, who is president of the Friends of the Maribyrnong Valley, a group that's worked to preserve and improve this community asset for more than 35 years. Judy's physical impairments had not prevented her from seeking grants and organising volunteers to plant trees and control weeds along the Maribyrnong River. But all that work was washed away with the flood, covered by a layer of silt and mud. But Judy has told me that she's determined to return the area to the place that locals love so often, in particular during the pandemic lockdowns. The walking tracks that became a respite from that strange cloistered existence we found ourselves in, the very lungs of the northwest. Judy and her Maribyrnong Valley friends are working with other community groups and local, state and Commonwealth levels of government because she said that's what's called for in times like this. In Judy's modest words, it's the spirit of Australia. Darren Symington and his family also felt that spirit of Australia after being flooded out and then unfortunately became the victim of callous opportunistic looters. At a time when Darren and his family were legitimately overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation and the body blows, we were able to offer assistance. I can happily report that he and his family are moving into a new rental home very soon. And while Darren has said that he wouldn't want to go through another flood, he said the little caring gestures of his neighbours have been something that will hold with him forever. A chat, an offer of help. Those who dropped in food. He said in times of stress he normally loses weight, but he's put on 5 kilos thanks to one too many Zinger burgers. I want to single out his children's teacher, Kim Simmons from Moonee Ponds West Primary. I say thank you for bringing the plight of Darren and his family to my personal attention so we could all work to help take away some of the burden, so the parents could go back to being parents to their children, not wondering about what would happen to them. It's the way the community wraps itself around their own that makes the seemingly unbearable bearable. I'd like to acknowledge the CEO of Maribyrnong City Council, Celia Haddock, and her team from the council. I want to acknowledge all the council workers, the Victorian Government staff, the members of the Victoria Police for working so seamlessly together. I also want to acknowledge Helen Swee, the CEO of Moonee Valley Council, and her team for the work they do. And in particular, I acknowledge again that often on the front line of disasters, it's not necessarily the Defence Force who are first in, although they do a great job. It's quite often our modest garbos and the modest council workers and gardeners from the local council depots who are leading the response. I acknowledge the Services Australia teams who were swiftly deployed to flood areas and the wider team for making the claims process so relatively painless. I want to give a special shout out to the dedicated and skilled team of orange overall heroes from the Victorian SES. These are people we don't think about when things are going well, but they're the ones we turn to in an hour of our greatest need. They did 60 waterborne rescues in the Maribyrnong area alone on that Friday morning as the river rose very fast. I acknowledge, of course, my federal colleague Daniel Molino, who shares the Maribyrnong River Valley representation, Katie Hall, our member for Footscray, Ben Carroll, a member for Nedri, Danny Pearson, the member for Essendon, the last two ministers in the state government, but diligent in their efforts. I also acknowledge the member for Melbourne, Ellen Sandell, for reporting issues in that part of the floods. I acknowledge my fantastic electorate staff who fielded hundreds of calls. To each and every person who volunteered time, money and resources, to every organisation, thank you. The floods will keep coming, cyclones will keep coming, we'll still have bushfires and drought, but also what will keep coming is Adam Lindsay Gordon's famous words: courage in one's own trouble and kindness in another's.
I thank the member.
Okay, have fun.
Are there any statements? I call the member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to talk on this motion, which commends all those who have helped and supported during the recent flooding. And also, I think, needs to call on governments, both local, state and federal, to ensure that they provide the much-needed support to local communities for their recovery. Deputy Speaker, the impact of the floods in my electorate was very similar to the impact of the floods in 2011. There have been some exceptions, however. For Skipton, for Lexton and for Lake Goldsmith in particular, what we saw in 2022 was very similar to what we saw in 2011. And the resilience of those communities and the way that they have dealt again with this flooding has been quite extraordinary. At times like this, communities, and I'm talking small communities, can go two ways. It can either be every man or woman for themselves, or a community coming together, working together to make sure that they deal together with the impact of the floods. And in Lake Goldsmith, in Lexton and in Skipton, that is what we've seen again. As a matter of fact, it is quite inspirational to be able to go to those communities, to meet with those who have been impacted, to meet with those who have helped and support them during their time of need, and to see the camaraderie, to see the bonds of friendship, and to see the way that this adversity is being dealt with collectively. On the front line, as with all floods, has been the SES, coordinating the response, making sure where preparation has been necessary, where preparation they've had time to do it, that it's been done in the most efficient and effective way possible. The sandbagging, the warning of residents, and in some instances, the ability to be able to tell residents that they need to leave their households. That is coordinated by the SES, but includes the CFA, includes local government and everyone else who is willing to play a part. But the coordination by the SES has been second to none. Not only when it comes to Skipton, Lexton and Lake Goldsmith, but also where there has been other flooding in my electorate, for instance in Aldansford, very near to Warrnambool, or in Hamilton where there was flash flooding. There we have seen the emergency services led by the SES and then local government and other community organisations coming together to make sure that the impact can be dealt with as best as we can deal with the impact of flooding. Flooding, though, does leave a real legacy, and that is one of the sad things that we need to continue to remember. And all levels of government, federal, state and local, need to remember this, because the water stays a lot longer than the help. The water stays, and the water in many instances will rot from the ground up houses. And we have to make sure that we're there to help and support those who deal with the long-lasting legacy of flood. Now, we did it in 2011. We didn't do all the amelioration, though, correctly, and we need to look at this now when it comes to these 2022 floods. Because if we don't get that right, then once again we're going to see the impact again when the next flood occurs. Now, whether that be ensuring that drains are properly cleared and cleaned, whether that's making sure that roadside vegetation, which is blocking drains, is cleared away, whether it is ensuring that levees are properly completed. All these things need to be looked at and dealt with, and we have to make sure that the preparation begins as soon as the clean-up is over in these communities. Can I also say that one of the lasting legacies, and we're seeing this more so in Victoria as a result of what didn't occur as it should have in 2011 and what hasn't occurred between then and 2022. And that is that where the rains and the flooding have damaged the roads, we have to fix them properly. It is no good. It is a waste of money just doing patch-up jobs. We have to do the job properly. And that means real investment in our road network and investment in doing the job properly. Now, Deputy Speaker, I'll give you a recent example that I've just been made aware of in my electorate, where we've had a brand new patch of road which has been impacted by a weather event that has left potholes where a farmer was able to put his foot into the hole and it went down as far as his hip. Now, that is not fixing a road properly. There is a front page of the Herald Sun today which says that the cost of repairing the Victorian regional and rural road network will be over $1 billion, over $1 billion. Now, I say to the government, you have allocated $2.2 billion to Dan Andrews's pet rail project, his urban rail link, which will probably be built sometime by 2050 maybe. It's going to cost, they seem to think, about $150 billion, so where the other $73 billion is going to come from, I'm not quite sure. That's the 50-50 component of the federal government. So, and this doesn't have a business case, it hasn't been to Infrastructure Australia. Take that money, that $2.2 billion that you have allocated in the budget to Dan Andrews's pet rail project, and put it into Victoria's road network. You know that it needs it. And in doing that, also say to all the contractors that you use, we want you to do the job properly. We want you to take your time, put a proper foundation and a proper base into the roads, and ensure that we're not going to need to patch them up, sometimes only weeks after they've been reopened.
That would be something really practical which would leave a long-lasting legacy from this government to the people of regional and rural Victoria. So far, all they've done is rip money out of regional and rural Victoria. In the budget, they rip money out of regional and rural Victoria. This would be a way of saying, sorry, made a mistake, shouldn't have done that, we shouldn't have done what we normally do, and that's go after and target regional and rural Victoria. We're not going to do this. It's not our modus operandi under this new government, even though that's what we're seeing already. Take that $2.2 billion from Dan Andrews' pet rail project and put it into our road network. That single-handedly could make a huge difference to our communities, because at the moment, and this is my great fear, we've seen a loss of life as a result of these floods. But fortunately, through the great work of SES, CFA, local government and others, we've seen that loss of life minimalised. My real concern is we're going to see more loss of life as a result of the deteriorating road network right across rural and regional Victoria, and in particular in the seat of Wannon. So I say to the government, this has become a serious safety issue. It's no longer something that the Andrews government can just turn a blind eye to. It's not something that the federal government can turn a blind eye to. They need to fix these roads. Otherwise, we're going to see more people lose their lives on our roads than we saw in the floods.
I thank the member. Are there any statements? And I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It was a tough day, the day that we were preparing for the floods in central Victoria. The warnings had gone out, and that's one thing that I will say is that I'd never could recall a Premier getting to their feet and an emergency services warning, this will be a major flood, homes will be lost, be prepared. And even in a town like Bendigo, where we have a network of creeks, we weren't prepared for the volume of water that came down. In the week leading up to it, the notice came out that Lake Eppalock, which is the major storage of water in our electorate, was already full. And locals know that once Eppalock is full, further downstream is in trouble. Once Lake Eppalock is full, there's a lot of water around and it could flood. It's rare for Victorians to get floods. And I do want to say that loudly, although we are getting more and more of them. They keep talking about it being once in 100 years, once in 500 years. Well, we've had the two once in 100 years in a decade. So you start to ask yourself, is this becoming the norm? And is our infrastructure fit for the weather events that we're expecting? And I'll say a bit more about that a bit later. But what I will say from the beginning is a big thank you and shout out to all of our SES units. Our SES units of Bendigo, Morong, of Heathcote, of Kyneton, of Castlemaine. I was actually due to catch up with the Castlemaine SES unit on the Wednesday before the big rain event of Thursday, Friday. And of course, rang them to say, look, you're probably really busy today. The last thing you need is me popping out. They were, in fact, sandbagging. Thousands of sandbags went out to homes and businesses throughout my electorate. And businesses and communities and homeowners are crediting the SAS, the early warnings and the sandbagging to what saved them. Lots of yards inundated, sheds inundated, lots of roadways, community infrastructure inundated, but the rain and the water came down so quickly and disappeared so quickly that a lot of homes were saved. The SES believed that pretty much Elmore was saved because of the sandbagging efforts and because the rain and the water was moving so fast. We had the Campaspe and the Loddon, two major river systems that feed into the Murray River that run through my electorate. And when you hear the volumes of water that were coming down across Kyneton and Castlemaine, you do feel for the communities who to this day are still in flood. We have a little bit of that guilt in my electorate that we know that the water will leave us and flood communities further upstream. And I do feel for the member for Mallee and the member for, particularly the member for Nichols, whose electorate is entering its 4th week of flood. We did sustain damage in my electorate in a number of properties in Heathcote and Morong. In total, it's estimated now 90 homes across Heathcote have sustained some damage in some way. Some of them will need to be knocked down, rebuilt. Some of them, it's outdoor infrastructure in sheds. And some amazing stories. The SES itself flooded because when the Campaspe is full, the water comes back up the creeks. We just didn't have a way to get the water out quickly. The community of Heathcote is quite resilient. It's about 40 minutes out of Bendigo, and it was actually cut off from Bendigo. In fact, every major highway into Bendigo was cut during this event, all of them sustaining damage, major damage. But the township of Heathcote was completely cut off. The bridge at Axdale was washed away. It's the image that many of us have seen, the first image of the impact of the floods. Such was the force of this water. The way in which it's damaged major roads is just unbelievable. So Heathcote were on their own. Nobody could get to them, and they had to do it themselves, and they did. The SES flooded, so they moved their entire operation to the CFA, where they ran their command centre to help people during the flood event that has happened. They are now continuing to help their community through recovery. We've had the ADF on the ground in Bendigo helping communities, not just to set up the relief centre, first of all, with the showgrounds. There were 10 deployed quickly to set up the relief centre, but also to help with the clean-up effort in Heathcote, where we had those homes damaged. There were at least 20 on the ground on the big clean-up day that they had to help remove rubbish.
A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
It's a hard
Okay. Okay.
So there should be something.
Yeah, I'm waiting for a member to move it. Okay, so who's going to move it?
So we're not doing any of this.
No, we're going straight to adjournment.
Okay. I call the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you. I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
Do we have a seconder?
I second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you. The member for Fisher. Okay, so I call the member for Fisher.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. On my tour to Fisher just a few weeks ago, I spoke with local community icon Deb from Witter in the northwest of my electorate. Deb has struggled to find aged care service providers to deliver some of the most essential services: house maintenance, healthcare and personal support, transport and community engagement. These are vital services which are becoming increasingly more difficult to access, especially if you live in regional or rural Australia. And the solution is not just simply pouring more money into it, like Labor would continue to spout. The public sector, with billions of dollars invested into social care, cannot meet the demands of senior Australians. We rely on a vast array of small and medium enterprises committed to quality care and localised support.
I think of small businesses in my electorate like Home Care Assistance Sunshine Coast in Caloundra. I think of service providers like Glasshouse Country Care in Biwa, who were recently named finalists in the Fisher Community Awards. A big shout out here to Kath Walwork, finalist for Employee of the Year, who is making a huge difference to the lives of vulnerable seniors in the hinterland of Fisher. These are groups of talented, hard-working, compassionate people operating local services, which make an enormous difference to the lives of senior Australians. And they deserve a government who has their back, not just with words, but with action. They deserve a government who gets on with the job of slashing red tape, ensuring that quality of outcomes, not endless paper pushing, that those things are front and centre. We did that in government by allowing social care enterprises to start, grow and expand across the country. They deserve a government who believes in addressing the real cost of living drivers, ensuring that both companies and clients can meet their expenses without fear of not having enough. That means cutting taxes on essentials like fuel, even as a temporary measure. That means simplifying our tax system without dithering, because Australians ought to keep more of their hard-earned money. It means allowing pensioners and veterans the ability to earn more before their support payments are impacted. That means making it easier for primary producers to grow, sell and transport local produce. That means ensuring reliable and affordable power. It means putting Australians' families first and their businesses at the centre of decision-making, not the unions. And that's the issue. Mr Deputy Speaker, one of the greatest challenges that Australians, particularly in rural and regional Australia, are dealing with, senior Australians under the aged care home packages and also with NDIS, is that people in rural and regional Australia are having great difficulties in finding service deliverers. And this is, I'm not going to stand here and say, you know, the world's gone to custard since May of this year on this point. But these are issues that people, particularly in the bush and in the regions, are pulling their hair out. They are entitled to get support. They've been assessed for support, but they just can't find the people to deliver those services. It is an invidious problem because the companies, the businesses that provide these supports will perhaps understandably want to go where the populations are, and that is understandable. But even in regional areas like parts of my electorate in Fisher, like out at Conondale, like in Mullaney, like at Witter, it's very difficult to try and get businesses that are operating on the coast quite happily to travel out and provide those services in the more regional areas. And that problem is amplified by, you know, a million when we start talking about people, you know, who are really in the bush. Kids who are on NDIS plans who can't get support. When I was on the NDIS committee in the previous couple of parliaments, this was a real issue, and it's something that government and the opposition really need to work together on to assist families who just can't get those sort of support services for their loved ones, and I'd be happy to work with the government on that point.
I thank the member for his contribution. The question is that the Federation Chamber do adjourn, and I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, the last few years have been incredibly difficult for many, particularly in the state of Victoria, with first the impact of COVID, the disruption that it had to our lives, and then this year with the flood event that we've had. It's been difficult on lots of businesses, lots of services, lots of organisations, but it's been particularly difficult for our festivals, our creatives and our music scene. Last weekend was the last Bendigo Blues and Roots Festival. The organisers and founders said after a decade they were moving on. They'd done their bit, they loved it, but they were exhausted. It's a real problem that we have in our creative sector, that quite often the volunteers who organise these wonderful community-based festivals, if they don't get funding to help put on the festival, if they get funding for gigs but not the actual wages, that they do struggle once they hit that 10-year mark. We all love the Bendigo Blues and Roots Festival in Bendigo, and its very purpose and foundation of why it started. And I really want to give a shout out to Amy and to Colin and to the committee who for a decade have helped deliver this wonderful festival. It started with a really basic premise. They wanted to bring live music back into the heart of Bendigo, good music, and pay artists properly so that they could perform and earn a decent wage. Think back to a decade ago and some of the toxic culture that we had in a bit of our night scene in Bendigo. There was like jelly wrestling and mud wrestling that was happening, just really awful, distasteful, derogatory events. This festival said we can be different, we can go out, we can have fun, but go out to enjoy music. The festival really focuses on encouraging people of all ages to enjoy music. And last weekend I had great joy in taking my two little toddlers to the Cushion concert that they held, and that was just fun. It was fun to see little people enjoying good music. But one of the key reasons why the festival is wrapping up after 10 years is because after 2 years of having to cancel through COVID and the impact of the floods, a lot of their partners were also not sure that they wanted to contribute or be involved in the way that they previously had. Funding for festivals is getting harder as funding is being diverted to other flood recovery activities. Businesses are struggling to host festivals because of insurance costs and because they too are struggling to get back up on their feet and have the staff. So longer term, we really need to look at how we support our live music industry and our creative sector, particularly in the regions. To the ones who are making festivals and concerts happen, good on you, because we know the challenges are against you. Our government has introduced a number of reforms that will really help in supporting the sector recover, but we need to also rethink how we do festivals. And this is where I do want to give a shout out to the Bendigo Blues and Roots Committee and what their plans are for next year. Whilst the 4-day festival will not be coming back next year, what they have done is organise the Bendigo Blues and Roots into a number of events. There'll be showcase days that'll be held at one venue. So it's like 4 days of festival over the year as opposed to 4 days in a row. The Bendigo Blues and Roots tram will still happen, so people can still jump on the tram, ride through town and enjoy blues music. They will still have many blues and roots artists visiting Bendigo and going to some of our smaller towns, concerts in the park. So we will still get the opportunity to enjoy great music organised by the Bendigo Blues and Roots Festival, but just spread out over the year as opposed to 4 days. It's an incredibly innovative way that Amy and Colin are thinking about how it can still achieve the same enjoyment and experience of music, but not the intensity over 4 days. To all the volunteers, to all the organisers, to Amy, to Colin, to their family, to all the sponsors over the decade, thank you for what you've done for our town and help us regain our place in the music calendar, but also to rebuild after COVID. It was great to see the town alive last weekend. It was great to see people out and about post the floods, post-COVID, not only enjoying each other's company, but coming together to enjoy music.
I thank the member. The question is that the Federation Chamber do adjourn, and I call a member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak about gas. This is a complex policy area, but the bottom line is incredibly simple. Australia will blow its carbon emissions budget if gas projects already in the infrastructure pipeline go ahead. We have set this carbon emissions budget, the total emissions that Australia can afford, in our global agreement to curb emissions. It is unconscionable that the possibility of new gas projects is even being entertained by this government, let alone the infrastructure for those those projects be given over $1 billion from the government. The social licence for taxpayer subsidies for coal, oil and gas has long since expired, particularly at a time of staggering national debt, a grim fiscal outlook and repeated warnings of economic hardship. The Australian public does not want public money to be spent on economically reckless fossil fuel projects and the infrastructure on which those projects rely. This, no doubt, is why the Minister, Catherine King, refuses to admit that the Middle Arm project is unquestionably an expansion of gas production. We have to remember that funding for this project was not this government's idea. It was Barnaby Joyce who announced billions of dollars of funding for the Middle Arm precinct as part of what the Morrison government called the Five Basins Gas Plan. It's a peculiar name for an allocation of funding that we're now led to believe is not a subsidy for a gas development. Opening a gas field deep beneath the land in the Catherine and Tennant Creek area known as the Beetaloo Basin was the first cab off the rank for Morrison's critically condemned.
I'll just remind the member to use the member's seat when referring to them, please.
For the Minister for Cook's critically condemned and then electorally rejected gas-led recovery. Why is it then that the Labor government has reviewed and removed so many of the member for Windsor's questionable infrastructure commitments, but has recommitted more than $1 billion in funding for expansion of infrastructure that will demand and rely upon gas from the Beetaloo Basin? It's been very difficult to get a straight answer from anyone in the government about what this precinct is for. It has steadfastly refused to answer simple questions about whether the precinct is intended for gas industry expansion, including petrochemicals manufacturing and gas processing using gas fracked from the Beetaloo Basin. However, the CEO of Tamboran Resources, the biggest player in Beetaloo, has been a bit more direct and has been a little bit more honest. According to him, gas which will be extracted from the Beetaloo Basin will be necessary for a full range of industrial purposes at the Middle Arm Sustainable Development Precinct near Darwin. This includes ammonia, urea production for fertiliser, hydrogen production, energy-intensive manufacturing, power generation and liquid natural gas for export. Excuse me. The Australian taxpayers are rightly very worried sorry, that the Middle Arm subsidy will be a Trojan horse, thank you, for significant gas industry expansion in the Northern Territory. We should be doing the opposite. I'm calling on the government to rule out gas industry expansion, including petrochemicals manufacturing at Middle Arm. If we don't do this, we are subsidising new fossil fuel developments in this country. Thank you.
I thank the member. And the question is that the Federation Chamber do adjourn, and I call the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Just under a week ago, I was thrilled to hear that aged care workers across our nation are in line for a much-deserved pay rise. The Fair Work Commission has made an interim decision for an increase to minimum wages of at least 15% for aged care workers in direct care roles on a number of different awards. It should have happened a long time ago, and it has only happened now because of the advocacy of our aged care workers, of unions and the broader aged care sector and the Albanese Labor government. The Commission has announced a further process to consider timing and the possible further increase for these workers. It will also consider granting pay rises for aged care administrative and support staff who do such great work. Our government promised to fight for a pay rise for Australians' aged care workers, and we have. We made a submission to the Fair Work Commission in August that unequivocally supported a wage increase. Unlike the previous coalition government, we delivered for dedicated, hard-working carers across the country, looking after some of our most vulnerable members of our communities. These are the carers who battled on during the challenging conditions of the COVID lockdowns, providing essential support for those in their care. Over recent years, I have hosted several forums in my electorate about the issues within aged care. Sad, tragic stories were commonplace. Tears have flowed as family members, care workers and aged care residents told their stories. Aged care workers do some of the most important and compassionate work in our communities. We thank them. Yet many get paid less than someone who stacks shelves in a supermarket. They spoke of how outstretched they are, overstretched and how understaffed they are. Donna, a personal care attendant in a local aged care facility in my electorate, spoke passionately about low wages, insecure work and the frustration of being unable to properly care for frail, elderly and vulnerable residents. Donna's hourly rate had only increased by $7 in 11 years. She has been employed in the aged care sector. She earns $21 per hour. This is a disgrace. Harley, a young personal care attendant, spoke equally passionately about inadequate pay while battling to care for residents he considered his family. This underpayment of these essential and dedicated workers must stop if we are to retain and attract skilled aged care employees to the sector. We know that consistently they do go above and beyond for elderly people in their care. The Albanese government submission to the Fair Work Commission made it clear we would fund an increase in award wages, and we will. We're fighting for a better future for aged care workers and older Australians. If we don't start paying aged care workers properly, we won't keep them and we won't have the care for our loved ones.
A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. Okay. As there is no quorum present, the Fed Chamber is now adjourned. And the Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. on Monday the 21st of November.